Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. As Vice Rector for Human Resources and Digital Infrastructure, I'm very happy to have you here with us today for our VU Matters, VU Talks event, our public lecture, which today has the title Dying for Some New Clothes, which intrigued me when I read it first, because of course I thought, is this a metaphor or is it to be understood literally? And of course it's both. It's about us, on the one hand, the consumers, and that's why we have the metaphor. But it's also about the others, the producers, in Rana Plaza and other places where unfortunately the dying is to be taken literally. So we have to be aware that almost all the products we buy and consume these days are connected to global supply chains, which connect producers very often in emerging or developing countries to our consumers in Europe, to us. And for years, these supply chains were managed and optimized to become ever more responsive to consumer market trends, more efficient and speedier. The fast fashion brand Zara, or run by Inditex, for example, became an industry leader by building a super responsive supply chain that could bring new designs to stores in a matter of weeks or months. Another ultra fast fashion brand, the Chinese Shein brand, can churn out thousands of new designs a day, and which are mainly sold online then through social media. Only very recently, however, we have started to ask ourselves what the true cost of this fast fashion actually is, the true cost for people and for our planet. We've started as consumers to think more about this as the public. Also, the legislator has started to work on that in many countries, starting off in France with the Loi de Vigilance, in the UK, the Modern Slavery Act, in Germany, the Lieferketten-Sorgfaltspflichtengesetz. I'm always out of breath when I finish with that word. And then, of course, there's also the European Union, which is working on the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD, which is currently being negotiated in the Council, between the Parliament, the Council, and the Commission in the so-called trilogue, and which will bring certainly changes in this area, which will bring changes for the better as far as the supply chains and human rights are concerned. But of course, if you change things in a system, it is also dangerous because it can affect competitiveness, it can have different results and effects which you do not want to like, and we know very, very little about this. We are still in a process of learning. And as learning is something we should do at a university, I'm very glad that we can learn today, and we can learn from one of the specialists in these fields, namely Miriam Wilhelm, who is full professor of sustainable supply chain management here at VU Vienna. She has been here for a year, I believe, and we're very happy to have you, Miriam, and to have you both at VU and to have you here today. Prior to joining VU, Miriam was full professor of global supply chains at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And further on, she obtained a doctoral degree at the Freie Universität Berlin and then started her academic career in Groningen, as I said. And she's been visiting various universities, University of Tokyo, University of Melbourne, and so on and so on. So we are very happy to have you for our talk now. And then we will have a brief discussion or a longer discussion that depends on whether we want this to discuss, because we can find topics for discussion almost endlessly. And this will then be managed by Gerald Renner, who is professor and head of the Institute of Production Management in the Department of Information Systems and Operation Management here at VU Vienna. So give a strong hand to Miriam, who will now start her lecture.
Okay, so good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Vice Rector Winner, for this very, very nice introduction or kind introduction. It is my pleasure tonight to be here today to talk about the topic that I feel very passionate about. It's about the challenge of making our global supply chains more sustainable. On the 24th of April 2013, an 8-story building called Rana Plaza collapsed in Dhaka, Bangladesh. 1,134 people died in this disaster. Most of these people were workers in one of the factories inside the Rana Plaza complex making garments, garments that were exported later and bought by us. This collapse of the building occurred shortly after a series of fatal fires, one at Tazreen factory, also in Dhaka, Bangladesh, where 112 people died, and another factory fire at Ali Enterprises in Pakistan, where 250 people died. Factory accidents like this are unfortunately not uncommon, but the scale of the disaster was unprecedented and made Rana Plaza the worst ever industrial incident in the story of the ready-made garment industry. Another reason why Rana Plaza received tragic fame was that it soon became clear that a number of global brands and retailers were producing their garments in the factories in the Rana Plaza building. Among these brands were Primark, Walmart, Mango, Benetton, and Zara. So Rana Plaza really put the spotlight on the conditions that workers suffer who are making our clothes. And for the first time, we started to care about how our clothes are being made. Ten years later, working conditions in factories around the world are still far removed from what the International Labour Organization considers decent work. Workers suffer from unsafe working conditions. They work excessive overtimes. It is not uncommon for a worker in the garment industry to work 10 hours per day, 6 days per week, and they receive very little pay for their work. So they're paid on a piece per rate basis, and at the end of the month, the money they make or they take home is not enough for them to make a living. Workers also suffer verbal and physical abuse from their supervisors, and they lack access to real freedom of associations and unions. And so all of these things are quite tragic. And a lot needs to be done, I think, in order to improve this. At the same time, modern slavery is on the rise. Modern slavery is an umbrella term for forced labor and forced marriages. Forced labor is a situation where workers or a person is coerced to work that hasn't offered his or her services. So this can occur because of threats of violence or because workers are threatened to be reported to the local authorities, which is a problem because a lot of these workers are migrant workers and can be undocumented. But there are also more subtle ways of how a worker can end up in a situation of forced labor. So often migrants occur very high costs in the migration and recruitment paths. And at the time when they start their employment, they might start their employment with very high debts. And these debts literally ties them to a certain broker or employer. And child labor, of course, is another form of forced labor. So the International Labour Organization estimates that the number of forced labor has risen to 27.6 million in 2021, and that is quite a substantial increase compared to 2019. And although these numbers are alarming, this might just be the tip of the iceberg because, as you can imagine, reliable numbers on forced labor are very difficult to obtain. And there are high environmental costs as well. So what you can see here on the picture is a photo of the Nile River in western Tamil Nadu in South India. And this river is an important source of water for local farmers who use it for agricultural purposes, but also for the local communities that use it as drinking water. This is the very same picture, and this is a photo taken by a member of our research team in 2017. And the foam that you see here on the surface of the water is toxic and is a result of the effluents from the textile dyeing process. Because Tirupur, the region in western Tamil Nadu, is very famous for its garment production. And yeah, a lot of the garment is exported. And at some point, the river was so heavily polluted that it was declared unfit for agricultural purposes, and dead fish were seen floating on the surface. So you might ask yourself now, why are these supply chain problems? Well, it is important to remember or to understand that companies like Mango, Primark, or Walmart, they did not own any of the factories inside the Rana Plaza complex. In fact, they don't own any factories at all. They have 100% outsourced their production. Walmart, for example, was sourcing its garment from a New York-based fashion importer called Success Apparel. Success Apparel, in turn, was sourcing its garment from a supplier called Simco in Bangladesh. And Simco received double the order than it could actually handle, than it had actually capacity for, and thus decided to subcontract part of the production to another supplier, and that supplier was located in the Rana Plaza building. And I think this example of Walmart already clarifies certain things that are so typical for many global supply chains. First, production is outsourced to suppliers, and these suppliers are legally independent entities. Thus, the lead firm, such as Walmart, doesn't have any financial stakes in a supplier, and they also do not have any hierarchical control over these suppliers. Second, supply chains tend to be long and can be quite complex, involving multiple companies, multiple intermediaries. We also consider the multiple tiers. And yeah, this makes supply chains quite complex, and for the lead firm, it's sometimes very difficult to understand which supplier is part of their supply chain. And third, particularly in the ready-made garment industry, a lot of the suppliers are located in emerging countries, recently also more and more in developing countries where regulations are weak. Thus, the local governments are often not sufficiently enforcing environmental and labor protection laws. So taking all these things together was kind of the starting point of my own research journey about 10 years ago. I had just finished my PhD, which was on buyer-supplier relations in the automotive industry. And back then, I did a lot of research, particularly on Toyota. And Toyota is famed for its ability to really implement its lean production system until the very, very last tier in its supply chain. So the Toyota production system is holistically implemented in every tier of the supply chain. And this has made Toyota the quality leader in the industry for many, many years. And back then I asked myself the question, why is it so difficult to do the same for sustainability? So why is it possible to implement quality standards in the whole extended supply chain? And why do we not manage to do the same for sustainability? And so what I'm going to present to you in the following are 4 findings from my research and that of others about the things we have learned in the past 10 years about how to make our supply chains more sustainable and why we have largely failed to do so. So finding number 1 is that voluntary standards have done little to improve sustainability in supply chains. The MIT does an annual survey with about 1,500 supply chain professionals each year about the state of sustainability. And one of these questions these professionals are being asked is, how do they rate the level of pressure they receive from different stakeholder groups regarding sustainability in supply chains? And what you can see overall is that the level of pressure is increasing throughout all stakeholder groups, but there are some groups which I think are more notable. So one of them are investors. As you can see here, they are increasing. The pressure from investors is more and more increasing. But also corporate buyers, so these are the customers of the firm, and to some extent also end consumers and governments. Another question which is asked in this very same survey is, so how do firms respond to these pressures? So what do they do to actually manage sustainability in their supply chains? And what you can see here from the responses is that an overwhelming share of companies is using audits, is relying on audits to manage sustainability, followed by supplier codes of conduct, standards and certification. Information technologies and supplier trainings are used to a lesser extent. So standards and certification audits and codes of conduct are all forms of what we consider private or voluntary governance. They're called private because they're private sector initiatives, or initiatives set up by private sectors to fill the vacuum of regulation that we often see in many sourcing countries. You find these standards at different levels. So some standards are formulated on the product level, and I gave you some example here, but there are many, many more. But you might be familiar with these, with some of these standards in your role as a consumer when you go shopping in a supermarket. So fair trade, for example, is a standard for sustainably sourced tea, coffee, and cocoa. The Marine Stewardship Council is a standard for sustainably caught fish, and the FSC is a standard for sustainably forestry, so sustainable wood products. In addition, we also have standards on the firm level. These are so-called supplier codes of conduct, and these are sets of environmental and social regulations that a lot of brands are issuing and that they want their suppliers to comply with. So almost every large firm has it. So if you go to the website of H&M, Zara, Mango, Primark, you will always find a supplier code of conduct. And the supplier has to sign off these codes of conduct as part of the purchasing agreement. And finally, we also have standards at the industry level. So the Responsible Business Alliance is a standard, is a joint standard of companies in the consumer electronics industry. And Amfori BSCI is another example, which is a larger initiative, a cross-sector standard. It's also a joint standard for the member of BSCI. So how does private governance work? So the first step would be to articulate codes of conduct or adopt certifications like the ones that I have just named you. So you set out a rule of environmental and social regulations that you want suppliers to comply with. The next step then would be to go to the supplier factories and check whether they actually comply with these rules. So this is done through regular audits. These audits typically take place every 2 to 3 years, can be done by third-party auditors or can also be done by the brands themselves. So they walk into the supplier factory with a sort of checklist, and then they will see to what extent the supplier is complying with a particular regulation or where the gap is, where do they not comply. And finally, there would be a remediation process. So suppliers have to show and document how they have resolved any non-compliances. And then sourcing decisions of the brand would be linked to the level of compliance of a supplier. But this system seems to have limited success. So the New Conversation project at Cornell University has analyzed data from 40,000 audits and has looked at the average number of non-compliances per audit per supplier over a time span of 6 years. And what you can see here really is that the average number of non-compliances really seems to stagnate over time. So suppliers are just not improving in their compliance level. And this finding is consistent across different countries, but also across different industries. So this brings me to finding number 2. Purchasing is the missing middle for sustainability in supply chains. In many organizations, the purchasing function is decoupled from the sustainability or compliance function. So purchasing is the function that is in charge of making supplier selection decisions, that is in charge of negotiating contracts with suppliers, negotiating prices with suppliers, and then eventually placing orders with suppliers. The sustainability or compliance function, as I said, is often a separate function, and they're in charge of monitoring suppliers' compliance. So they would organize audits, compile the audit data, and, well, detect violations, detect any violations. For researchers, it is very, very difficult to obtain supplier compliance data, but it is even more difficult to obtain order information from companies, because companies are usually very, very secretive when it comes to any purchasing-related information, because they consider this, of course, sensitive or competitive information. So what is quite remarkable, I think, is this study by these three colleagues, Amengual, Distelhorst, and Tobin, that not only received access to supplier compliance data, but also access to order information from one large American retailer. And when they pooled these two data sources, they found that purchasing decisions are really, really quite decoupled from compliance performance of suppliers. So purchase orders continued no matter whether a factory improved or not. And this is, of course, sending mixed signals to suppliers. And what these researchers conclude here is that purchasing is currently the missing middle. And this leads to a lack of incentives for suppliers to actually improve their compliance levels. Beyond the lack of incentives, it seems that purchasing can have an even negative impact on suppliers and workers. So inaccurate product specifications and forecasting are not uncommon, unfortunately not uncommon purchasing practices, but they lead to problems for the suppliers because they will find it very difficult to plan and manage their production ahead of time. And this, in turn, has detrimental impacts on workers because workers often end up working excessive overtime hours. So on top of the 60 hours that a garment worker is working per week, they are asked to work additional hours in order to fulfill large orders in peak times. And yeah, this finding was also confirmed by a more recent survey by the International Labour Organization that has asked several suppliers in the garment industry, do the following purchasing practices lead to overtime hours? And the majority, so 75%, named low forecasting accuracy as a main reason for overtime, but also too short lead times and inaccurate technical specifications. So finding number 3 is that social sustainability is harder to manage compared to environmental sustainability. This picture was taken in 2015. This is from a field trip in China. Again, a picture or photo by a colleague. And we were working on a project with Philips in the Netherlands. And so what you see here on this picture, the first picture, are workers involved in tin soldering. Tin soldering is a process where two metal surfaces are joined together by a filler material. And workers are supposed to wear dust-proof masks when they execute these tasks. And what you can hopefully see on these pictures is that these workers are not wearing dust-protective masks. And in fact, the audit at this particular supplier revealed that 30% of the workers did not wear the protective gear that they were supposed to wear. The second picture shows storage bins for hazardous waste. And because the waste is hazardous, it is supposed to be contained in a secondary container, which, as you can see here, is missing. And so one of the things we wanted to understand is what can be done about this? So is it possible to improve the environmental and social compliances at the supplier? And are there any differences in addressing social versus environmental issues at the supplier? And for this purpose, Philips gave us access to all 220 Chinese suppliers that are part of Philips' Supplier Sustainability Development Program. We were also provided compliance information over several years of all these suppliers. And in addition, we were allowed to send out a survey to these 220 suppliers. Plus, we also did in-depth case studies with 10 of these suppliers. And what we found is that there are several factors that can influence the compliance level for environmental criteria positively at the supplier side. And you can see this here with the blue arrows. So regulatory agencies, for example, meaning the pressure supplier receives from regulators, so the enforcement quality of local authorities has a positive impact and leads to the improvement of supplier environmental compliance. But also things that Philips was doing with its suppliers. So the level of trainings, of knowledge provision of Philips to suppliers also mattered, and particularly lean trainings we found has a positive impact in influencing environmental compliance of suppliers positively. And third, the level of trust, something we call relational capital here in our study, also has a positive impact on supplier environmental compliance. By contrast, we couldn't find a single indicator or a single factor that was positively linked to supplier social compliance. And so one of the explanations we come up with in the study is that environmental compliance or environmental sustainability is more technical in nature and can be addressed through technical solutions or additional investments. So for example, it's relatively easy for a supplier to put a secondary waste bin around hazardous waste, but it is much harder for the supplier to convince its workers to wear protective gear, even though the supplier might provide all workers with protective gear. Another example would be freedom of association. It's very difficult to install real freedom of association in factories when unions are suppressed in a country. So the conclusion is that social sustainability is much more socially and culturally rooted and thus much harder to address for suppliers. So finding number 4, which is also the last finding, companies do not have enough oversight over their supply chains. In the beginning of 2019, I wrote a blog article together with 2 Australian colleagues with the title, "Almost every brand of tuna on supermarket shelves shows why modern slavery laws are needed." This blog article appeared in the beginning of 2019, as I said. That was around the time when the Australian government was discussing implementing the Modern Slavery Act in Australia. And we didn't expect it, but we received a huge interest in that blog article, and over 100,000 people read this article within 2 days. In this blog post, we report the results of a small study that we did where we asked 10 global brands of seafoods if they're able to confidently claim that their supply chains are free of forced labor. And only 1 brand was able to do so. And of course, a lot of the people that contacted us wanted to know which tuna brand should they buy. I mean, we didn't see this as our task to promote a certain tuna brand. But what I want to say is, for us, actually, the results were not that surprising, because we know that a lot of the companies are not able to trace their supply chain back to the source. And that's just not only for tuna. So yeah, it's less of a surprise than that supply chain transparency in general is low. What you see here is a study done by an NGO called Know the Chain. So Know the Chain regularly assesses the disclosure quality of several companies in different sectors. And what you see here is an example from the garment sector, where about 50% of the companies are disclosing their first-tier supplier list. This is actually quite high percentage. If you compare it with other sector, the garment industry is actually disclosing much, much more about their supply chains than other sector. And this is very likely so because the garment industry has been so much in the spotlight for bad working conditions. But what you can see here also is that a much smaller percentage, only 19% of companies are disclosing their second-tier suppliers, and almost no company is disclosing their third and fourth-tier suppliers. And there are two explanations for the low disclosure quality. One is, of course, that companies do not want to disclose their suppliers again, for competitive reasons. But another very likely explanation is that companies often do not know their suppliers. And particularly when it comes to the second and third and fourth tier, they do not really know who these suppliers are. And by the way, one thing I want to highlight is that the disclosure quality is not necessarily better for luxury brands. So luxury brands are scoring very, very low across all dimensions of disclosure, supply chain disclosure quality. So, yeah, reflecting on these 4 findings might be a bit disheartening here for some of you in the audience, but I hope that in the remaining part of the talk I can present a somewhat more positive outlook when I want to discuss some of the more recent trends and development that are happening right now that can hopefully accelerate the progress of making supply chains more sustainable. And of course, here at WU, or in my upcoming years at WU, I'm closely observing and monitoring these trends, and also thinking about how to start interesting research projects, maybe also with colleagues, on these topics. So the first development is that there is a paradigm shift. So governments around the world have issued mandatory due diligence legislations. And you find some prominent examples here. So the US Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act from 2021 would be such an example. The German Act on Corporate Due Diligence Obligation in Supply Chain, the infamous Lieferketten-Sorgfaltsschutzgesetz, that came into effect in January this year. The EU regulation on deforestation-free products that will come into effect from next year, and then the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence legislation or directive that is currently being discussed in this tripartite process. So due diligence is meant to be a paradigm change because it is moving or trying to move companies from the voluntary adoption of standards and certifications towards binding human rights and environmental obligations. So companies have an obligation to detect and address any adverse impacts they have on planet and profit. And they do it through a due diligence process that is laid out here. So first, they are asked or required actually to identify and assess any adverse impacts in their own operations, but also the operations of their subsidiaries and of their supply chain partners. If they detect any adverse impact, they have to design adequate mechanisms to seize, prevent, or mitigate these adverse impacts. They have to track their performance on this, and they also have to communicate to the public what they have done to address these adverse impacts. And all of this has to be embedded in policies and management system. And in fact, it is the duty of the corporate directors to implement and oversee the due diligence process. As you can imagine, it is a new legislation, and a lot of companies are currently struggling with how to implement mandatory due diligence. This is taken from a survey conducted in Germany at the end of last year, so shortly before the introduction of the German Corporate Mandatory Due Diligence Act. And what you can see here, that a large share of companies, of 41%, said that they do not really feel well prepared, or they do not really know how to identify and assess adverse impact in their supply chain. So they are lacking data, and they don't know how to adequately assess any sustainability risks in their supply chain. Also, companies to struggle with struggle with designing adequate remediation mechanisms. So if child labor is actually detected in the supply chains, what can they do to cease, prevent, or mitigate these adverse impact? And so what we're seeing at the moment is that there is a market developing around the assessment of supply chain sustainability risks. And you have some of the names of some of the largest market players here on that slide, but there are actually many, many more. So there are a lot of startups also, technology startups, that are offering to assess supply chain risks for companies. And what all of these companies have in common is they have different products and services in terms of data sources, software tools, and consulting services. So what they often do is they pool large amounts of data, publicly available data, often also with the help of AI. And this is often trade data, but also country risk indicators like freedom of press levels in the country. And based on that, they are informing companies if they have any risks in their supply chains. And I think this is a very interesting development that, we're observing with great interest here at WU, because it raises a lot of interesting questions, right? So first of all, can these companies really provide a solid risk assessment on behalf of their clients who very often do not know their supply chains, right? So how exactly does this work based on publicly available data? Because supply chain data, as we know, is very hard to obtain and maybe doesn't even really exist. Second, what does it mean for the success of the mandatory due diligence legislation? Can companies outsource the risk assessment, or can companies outsource mandatory due diligence to these service providers? Because, this was probably not the intention of the law, but it will say a lot about, I think, understanding how this works will tell us a lot about how successful the new legislations will be. So another interesting trend I'm observing is that there are more and more business model innovations for sustainable supply chains. So you see a lot of startups and smaller companies emerging that have really put the traceability of supply chains, they really made it the core of their unique selling propositions. So one famous example is Tony Chocolonely. It's a Dutch chocolate brand. You might have seen it or heard of it. You can actually also buy it in Austria, so I've seen it here on supermarket shelves as well. And Tony Chocolonely is using the slogan, all chocolate 100% slave-free. So they're guaranteeing to their customer that they can first of all trace the cocoa up to the source, but they can also guarantee you that there's no forced labor or any other labor rights violations involved in their supply chain. This is another example from the garment industry, so based on blockchain technology. So what you can see here is a garment brand, or an example for actually a knitted jumper, and which has a QR code in its label inside the jumper. And as a customer, you can scan the QR code, and then you will be informed which alpaca farm was producing the wool, but also which intermediary followed after that. Yeah. So what is the whole supply chain? So not just the farm level, but each and every step of the supply chain is displayed to you, and having a fully traceable supply chain. Similar applications you can also find in other sectors. So the brand Farmers Direct Coffee also offers a QR code on its packaging. And when you scan the QR code, you can see which particular farmer has harvested your coffee beans and which other parties were involved in bringing these coffee beans to the store and eventually to you. So I think these are, of course, very interesting developments, but since most of them are smaller businesses, it will be interesting to see whether and how they can scale up. So next time when you buy a t-shirt, I want you to think of the supply chain behind it. So this is maybe the most important message of my talk. I think a lot of the sustainability issues we have is because of the fact supply chains are so opaque, and that we have and the fact that we have shown so little interest in the supply chain behind a product. So next time when you buy a t-shirt, I urge you to think about the supply chain and also signal to companies that you're not only interested in a product, but that you are also interested in a supply chain behind it. So keep asking critical questions. Thank you very much.
take our seat. Yeah. Thank you very much for your very inspiring presentation, very interesting. I would underline what our Vice Rector, Martin Minna, already mentioned, that we are very happy that you're joining VU, and also that you bring additional expertise to our programs, to research in the field of sustainable supply chain management, as well as procurement. Topics that are very important for our programs, and since a couple of years have not been so developed, but now we have the expert here since more than 1 year. In the end, I think we learned also a lot of interesting topics about topics we partially did know, but of course not in scientific preparation and in investigation and the provided details. My question is, or a first question that I would like to address is, what can customers do to want to make better choices when buying garments? The question is also, what is a better choice in the end? What might be your thoughts in this regard?
Okay, yeah. Yes, I was expecting this question, but yeah, it is indeed very, very difficult, of course, for consumers to make the right choices. If you buy a t-shirt for €5, you can probably assume that the worker who was making your t-shirt did not receive enough pay to make a living. At the same time, if you buy a designer t-shirt, a very luxury brand t-shirt, you can also not be guaranteed that the working conditions are good. So this makes it really difficult for consumers to make the right choices. But yeah, one thing I was hopefully able to show you is that unfortunately we can also not rely on certifications. I mean, certifications or standards are probably better than nothing, but it is unfortunately necessary for us consumers to do a little bit of homework to understand how demanding a particular standard is. So standards really vary in their, how demanding they are, how stringent the verification process is that is attached to a standard. So I think understanding that is really important, because some brands, of course, in order to be able to say, oh, our products are 100% certified, they choose the easier standards compared to the more demanding ones. So that's one thing I think unfortunately involves some work for us, but where we can do a little bit of homework in trying to understand what a good standard is. So particularly for garment, I think fair wear, of course, is I would say one of the more trustable standards. And then the thing I said in the end, I think we really need to signal to companies that we are interested in their supply chains. And so I think only this will force companies to really do the work and start disclosing more and more. And as I said earlier, the garment industry is actually quite advanced compared to a lot of other industries where we have shown zero interest how the supply chain looks like. Yeah, but I think it's only really our interest and us pushing these companies that makes companies disclose their suppliers and their practices. Yeah.
I think I would like to pick up the standards and the presentation. These are also these labels that you have presented. No? So these are this label like fair trade and so on. These are these private standards that are behind. And I think you also addressed in this context that audits might be also an issue. If they are taken every second or third year, that might not be very effective. Maybe efficient, but not effective. So that is in terms of reducing costs, but not very effective in really figuring out what is going on. And I think this example of Rana Plaza was also the case where I think very short before this accident happened, there was an audit carried out.
A lot of suppliers were actually audited inside Rana Plaza, right? Yeah, that's true.
So therefore, from this perspective. And therefore, the question is also, is this, what are the issues in the end in terms of this effectiveness of the audits, and what might be also maybe solutions to overcome or to provide improvements of this process?
I think audits have a negative reputation by now, and particularly in the academic community, I think we kind of have decided that audits are not working. But I still think this is the best tool we have to get verifiable data on what's going on in a supplier factory. So where I would like to see more research, and unfortunately Pavel is not here tonight, but one of the things I would like to do in the next years also is to really look closer at how can we make audits better, because I don't think audits per se are a bad thing. It's just that we haven't really looked into differences between audits, and audit quality really differs. It differs per auditor also. Some auditors are very experienced, very well trained, and they can detect misconducts in supplier factories that are maybe not so easy to spot at once. And some audits, and the majority of audits are just done very sloppily, right? And I think there is really not a lot of research on the quality of audits, of social compliance audits. Because when you talk to practitioners in the field, they all say, yeah, in the end, this is the only way for us to get verifiable data, because what these tech companies are doing right now by pooling all these different data sources, none of these sources are really on the supplier level. I think only SEDEX has really supplier data, and the supplier data that SEDEX has is often based on supplier self-assessments. So suppliers get surveys that they have to fill out, and nobody's really checking whether this is true or not. And this cannot be a great way to assess risks in a supply chain. So yeah, I do think we should rethink the role of audits, and we definitely need more research on how to make audits better. Yeah.
Maybe also to combine it more or less with real data, real-time data access, not only taking, let's say, a sample out of 2 years and to combine in that way. I think that would have been the contribution from Pavel.
Yeah, absolutely, like modern technologies, remote auditing and so on. I mean, there's a lot more possible, right? Having better auditor training, but definitely there are things that can be done, and which we also need to do.
So maybe one more question from my side before, of course, we invite also the audience to ask, and I think we have also colleagues that will provide the microphone that all of us can also participate in the discussion. We still have time, so from this perspective, it should be fine. But maybe one question before we start this, in particular, what might be the major challenges of companies in terms of implementing the due diligence regulations that you have addressed, and I think there are a couple of them, not only one, as in Germany, but also the European Union level, like it was also addressed in the end, what are the developments going on. And I think, of course, they're also linked with the issue you have mentioned, that maybe there's good information about the tier 1 supplier, as a one stage above, upstream in the supply chain, that there might be a good understanding what is going on. But if you go to tier 2 or tier 3 and so on, less and less information is available, or in particular also for smaller companies. I think this is also one of the differences between the European law and the German due diligence regulation, that European level you need also to integrate smaller companies, so closer to SMEs in these activities, and how they might have a chance to provide the information, the obligations in terms of risk assessment, what they have to do in the supply chain.
Absolutely. Well, I think the first challenge for companies is that, if you can call it a challenge, that sustainability in supply chain is not a moral or ethical expectation anymore. It is becoming more and more hard law. So companies have to respond to that. And this also means, of course, that they need to do their homework. I think right now, when you talk to companies, a lot of them have a rather negative perspective on these legislations, because they see it as additional bureaucracy, more work for them shortly after COVID. So they really see it as another burden, or mainly a compliance exercise, like just much more paperwork to fill out. And I think this is completely the wrong perspective on this. And I think there are some companies, though, that see it as an opportunity to really track, to really trace their supply chain, to really start doing the work to understand their supply chain better. And I think these are also the companies that that might be able to get a competitive advantage out of this one day. So right now, of course, there's a lot of additional work required. Yes, that's true. But it's the work that companies need to do in order to understand their supply chains. And I think those that master that, they might also be much better positioned in the future. Because as I've also shown you today, investors are more and more asking for it. Consumers are more and more asking for it. So it is, in general, stakeholders asking for more and more transparency in supply chains.
There might be also different awareness in terms of, let's say, Europe, how companies are anticipated in Europe, and also the suppliers in the supply chain, for example, in Far East, how they feel about this. I think there was also discussion on in terms of obligatory, because it's obligatory in the end compared to voluntary standards they fulfill, that it might be also reduce the willingness to do something voluntary if this is put in an obligatory setting.
Yeah, of course. Like, all the like negative views you get right now. And the other point you mentioned was, the smaller firms. I'm not sure it's necessarily harder to do due diligence for a larger firm or smaller firm. I mean, smaller firms also have maybe less suppliers, right? So in a way, it might be relative, but I don't know. Yeah.
Fine, thanks. So therefore, we have time also for questions in the audience. I have further questions, so to be sure, and a backup. But of course, you are invited to ask your questions if you're interested here. Yeah, please, colleague.
Hello. So thanks also from my side for the very inspiring and interesting talk. My question goes a bit in the same direction of one of your questions, Gerald, Rainer. You showed in the beginning, when you showed about the compliance levels of the audits not improving. Can you give us a bit more details on what could be underlying reasons for that? Is it that the brands do not impose sanctions upon failing in the audits, or is it that basically only partial dimensions are addressed and then others are suffering, and this goes like in circles because it was also going over time? Or can you give a bit more details on that?
Yeah, I mean, it is really the lack of incentives for suppliers, right? So the fact that it does cost them to comply. They often have to make additional investments. If they want to reduce overtime, they need to hire additional staff, additional workers. If they want to pay their workers higher wages or social insurances, this usually incurs costs on suppliers. And if the experience is that purchasing departments don't really care about these improvements, then of course they're not complying, right? I mean, of course they have no incentive to raise their compliance level. So it's really the lack of incentives for suppliers, because they're not being rewarded, but they're also not really punished. So I think a lot of brands, they are, of course, you need to pass the audits somehow. But passing the audits can mean a lot of things. And I've seen also a lot of dirty tricks played by companies that they are, often audits are using some kind of traffic light system, like they're the absolute no-go kind of criteria, right? Like child labor, of course. If this occurs in a supplier factory, then you're out as a supplier. But then there are other things where there's a lot more leeway, right? So what are excessive overtimes really? Is it really the overtime stipulated by laws, or can we just, be a little bit more generous on that one? And I've seen that also, right? So there's also a lot of like tricks being done, because in the end, of course, these brands, they want their suppliers to meet some kind of minimal bar. And once suppliers do so, then it doesn't matter really, right? So a supplier doesn't really have an incentive to go way beyond this minimal bar. Yeah.
Thanks. Professor Wimmer, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the excellent talk. I was wondering what the new legislation does is that it gives the aims to the companies, protect human rights, but the way to achieve these aims is left to the companies. So the companies fulfill roles which traditionally were fulfilled by the state, namely regulation. They build up regulation. So this means I give a huge amount of power to these companies. That is what this legislation does. So they should solve the issue that the state cannot solve because it's abroad. And on the other hand, the companies are part of the problem because they don't care, they don't look after it, they prefer to produce cheaper clothes to make more profits, whatever. So do these two things fit together? What is really true? Are we sending the fox into the henhouse? Or what are we doing really? Do we know what we are doing? What is your take on that?
Yeah. I'm not a legal expert, but my understanding of the law is And this is already a paradigm shift. It's not about punishing companies that have labor rights violations in their supply chain, because we kind of assume that that's happening anyway, right? And so far, those companies that go public with these things, they are the ones that were often punished by their stakeholders. So I think what the law wants is want companies to practice due diligence. So it is about what could you have known about your supply chain. So this is where companies have to get better. And this is where also, where companies have these legal obligations. And the EU law is actually the most ambitious one. I mean, we will see what the final version of this will be, but it also wants to impose a civil liability on corporations that fail to fulfill their obligation to address any adverse impacts. Yeah, so it's really about trying to push companies. Did you do the best you can to identify and address these risks that you have in your supply chain? Not so much punishing them for things that actually happen in a supply chain.
Fine, I think, colleague. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much for a fascinating, very insightful talk about a topic which I'm very passionate about, and I guess everyone else here is as well. One thing that I was thinking about as you were speaking is that, of course, this topic of sustainability is not new. I mean, there have been several generations of entrepreneurs who've tried to address it. Everything with a fair trade label, I mean, that's, I don't know, 30 years old or something like that. Or I think even the garment industry, examples like Hess Natur. Now, I don't know what their supply chain is, but I mean, they've been around for a very long time. So, I mean, I think you showed very well why why things have been so intractable, why they haven't changed. So I think that was, for me, that was very enlightening. As my question is just, do you think now, I mean, possibly in the past, these issues were much more of a marginal topic, not mainstream, so it seems now this, or for a while, this topic is mainstream. But are you optimistic that there is a momentum now that there will be a change? You know, the graphs you're showing there with nothing happening. Yeah. What's your? I mean, of course, we don't know, but what's your feeling? What's your informed view?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have to be optimistic, right? Because I'm doing research on this. So, I mean, of course, it is also our role to be very critical with what's happening. And I am very critical of, attempts to outsource this obligation, if that's what's really happening at the moment. But yeah, in general, I do think there is a huge change. Sustainability is a mainstream topic now in research. I think you can see it at the WU also. So many great colleagues doing work on sustainability, and they're becoming more and more. And yeah, it used to be a really fringe topic. One of the other favorite examples I often use in my own teaching or classes is the Nike child labor scandal from 1996, where Nike back then responded to the child labor by saying, we don't make shoes, so these are not our suppliers. That's happening outside the firm boundaries. We're really not in charge. How can we have control over what's happening at the suppliers? So I think if you look at this journey or at this time spent, a lot has already happened, that this is, of course, not an acceptable answer or response anymore. If legislator can really make it a hard law, that remains to be seen. But even if they fail, I do believe the homework that at least the more progressive companies are doing right now, and they do exist, it is a good thing. So for example, the Modern Slavery Act was introduced in 2019, so that there's a little bit more experience. But from my research colleagues, when we did some interviews in Australia, we really learned that a lot of these companies only really started to deal with it since the law was put in place. If the law is effective, I mean, that's a more complicated discussion, but it did change something, So companies all of a sudden really. Before that, the supply chain started at the border of Australia with the importer level, and now they really have to look deeper. And also the conversation has moved up to the boardroom, and I think that is also a very, very important change that has happened. Before that, it was a fringe topic. Somebody was dealing with it in the company, but usually that person didn't have a lot of hierarchical power. But I think sustainability is really a board topic now. So I am positive or optimistic,
So over there. question.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. You mentioned earlier that luxury brands are usually not that sustainable, and knowing that they produce less, I was wondering if this lack of sustainability comes from the material they use, or more in general because of lack of sustainability or supply chain matters.
I think luxury brands are really less in the spotlight. So, yeah, it's a bit of a tough question. I think what this NGO was evaluating is mainly disclosure quality. And the truth is we don't know much about luxury brands and the working conditions. I mean, I think a lot of the factories are often the same. So it's not necessarily that they are sourcing from completely different suppliers. So so at least from as far as I'm aware of, the suppliers can be actually the same sometimes for luxury brands and high street fashion retailers. But I haven't really seen any studies on luxury brands. And I think that's because, yeah, there hasn't been a lot of focus on them. So I can't say with certainty that they have more or less labor rights violations, or if there are more or less environmental concerns in these factories. But the fact that they disclose so little is already quite concerning. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Also from my side, was really interesting. I would be interested in what's your assessment on what this means for the future of fast fashion as such, because it seems like it's not too far away that they actually have to consider a clean supply chain by law. So do you think it would still be possible for those brands that you mentioned, for example, Primark, to stick to this current business model that they have of overproduction and throwing away clothes in large quantities? Or do you think it really means for them to turn away from the current business model that they're pursuing?
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. I think here you really have to distinguish between environmental and social sustainability. I think on the social side, these firms like Primark and H&M are actually doing a lot more than others in the industry, just because they've been put so much in the spotlight. Actually, I also have an ongoing project with Primark, so they do quite a lot actually to improve working conditions at their supplier factories. But of course, the business model of fast fashion in itself is unsustainable environmentally, right? And I'm not sure. I mean, I haven't really talked about that so much tonight, but I'm not really sure how these brands want to change that, because the fact that we keep rebuying fashion and that needs to be faster and faster, that the cycle needs to be faster and faster, that cannot be a sustainable business model, even if you use recycled content, circular supply chains, and so on. Yeah. So I think here I would really distinguish between the social and the environmental dimension here.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for this very insightful conversation. And I wanted to know whether us customers, how can we spot greenwashing and how can it be avoided on a corporate level?
How can we spot what, sorry?
Greenwashing.
Greenwashing, yeah.
Because you spoke about H&M
yeah.
and Primark.
Yeah.
That's why my question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on greenwashing. I mean, in the end, it's all about transparency, right? And as a general rule of thumb, from what I've seen in the sustainability reports, is that these companies like H&M and Primark, whatever you might think of them, but they're still a lot more transparent than companies or brands that are not in the spotlight at all. Like Prada, for example, was one of the companies in the Know the Chain report that scored really badly. Greenwashing, so what is greenwashing really? Is it like deceiving or, faking something or lying, or is it about being secretive? And I think the problem we have at the moment is that most companies are secretive, and we can only evaluate and validate what they're saying when they're disclosing, right? So yeah, sorry, I can't really give a satisfactory answer maybe, but my point is the greenwashing might be less of a problem, but the lack of disclosure is a problem, yeah.
I think over there. Kavita.
Thank you for this excellent talk. My question is a little bit more on the competitiveness, because regulation is going to be quite different in the EU or at a country level or in Australia or elsewhere. And how do you see companies reflecting on regulation and complying with that and their competitiveness? And are they talking about moving elsewhere because it's too much of a hassle to comply?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And of course, you hear this concern a lot, and maybe you also have some thoughts to share on this one. But that's probably the number one complaint you hear from companies. It puts us in a competitive disadvantage to companies in China that don't have to follow these strict laws, or even company in the US. But I mean, the law is not just, does not only apply to companies headquartered in Europe, but also companies with a substantial turnover in Europe, right? So the moment you want to sell your products on the European market, I mean, there are some, I don't know it by heart, but you know, you have to have a certain threshold, of course. But the moment you want to do business in Europe, the law also applies to you, even if you're a Chinese company or US company or elsewhere. So I think this is the way that Europe tries to have somewhat of a level playing field. But yeah, I mean, let's just hope Europe is going to be a big enough and significant consumer market in the future to kind of maintain that power. Yeah.
First of all, thanks for the interesting talk. When looking at these countries where workers are mistreated, are you optimistic about the local laws in these countries getting better, or are they going to stay the same for the foreseeable future? Yeah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. Also, very good question, and I actually also have a research project on that right now. But so definitely, I mean, there's a correlation between enforcement quality and economic development in a country. And so China is a great example because in China you can see that there are different provinces, and these provinces have different economic growth levels, right? So the ones in the eastern coastal regions are the more developed regions or provinces, and there are studies on that also. And these regions also have higher enforcement quality. So China is interesting because you can really see, particularly for environmental sustainability, they have really increased the enforcement quality. First of all, the laws were made stricter, but also the enforcement quality increased. And somewhat you can also see it for labor, but to a lesser extent. So yeah, definitely. I think as a country develops, the enforcement quality is also likely to increase. But then there are always other countries, right? So what you see in garment right now is, I mean, Bangladesh is not even so much the hotspot these days anymore. It's actually Ethiopia, right? So a lot of garment manufacturers are now moving to Ethiopia. So there are always other countries you can find where you might have less hassle with the regulators. Yeah.
Maybe one short question from my side. You mentioned the complexity of the supply chain is an issue, and then transparency, of course. The question might it be a solution, for example, to have shorter, more local supply chain also in the garment industry, or more general, is there a future of textile or garment industry in Europe? And if this is the case, might be this an issue to solve it, or is there also maybe it's not only to have shorter supply chains, but it's even in Europe not so easy to guarantee that working conditions are proper. For example, the Prato region, as one example.
Yeah, true. You have sweatshops in Italy also. You have sweatshops in the UK. That also shows that it's not only always about, industrialized nations versus emerging economies. I don't think the geographical distance matters so much. I think supply chains are complex because a lot of brands made it that way. They prefer it that way. So the key to transparency is, of course, to know your suppliers. And all these examples I show you from all these enterprises and startups and these new business models, these are all companies that purposefully work long-term with suppliers and with a smaller group of suppliers. And that, of course, comes with a very obvious disadvantage. You cannot play the market mechanisms of having the lowest price anymore. But if companies decide to source their items from a stable set of suppliers and decide to do it on a long-term manner, then I would say the geographical distance actually really doesn't matter.
Fine. One more question, please.
Yeah. Okay, so thanks for your presentation. I have a question. So for those countries where these regulations are already in effect, like the UK and Australia, did you see some effects of these regulations, or is it too early maybe to observe this, because they're quite young, I think, right?
Yeah, no, thank you, very good question. So UK and Australia have the Modern Slavery Act, and I think it's important to understand that this is kind of the first generation of legislations, and they function very differently. They are mainly based on disclosure rather than imposing a mandatory due diligence. So the idea was that they're merely asking companies to disclose what they have been doing. So companies in the UK have to issue a modern slavery statement at the end of the year, but they could also say, we haven't done anything. And that would be enough for them to comply with the legislation. Yeah, so I think a lot of people agree that these disclosure-based laws have largely failed because the level of transparency didn't go up to what we have hoped for. So there are a lot of studies on this by other researchers that have also concluded the modern slavery statements have become longer over the years, but they haven't become more informative. Yeah? And that's why I think it's important to understand that these disclosure-based laws, they function quite differently from the mandatory due diligence, and particularly if there's also civil liability imposed on that. That could be a game changer, but we don't know yet, so we have to see that, yeah. But the potential, let's say, is there.
Okay, I think there's one more question. Yeah, please.
Yeah. Hey, thank you very much. The talk is very interesting. And you just said that you don't think that the geographic location really matters. But I would say, don't you think that in a cultural and socio-demographic setting, it might play a role? Because, of course, we have to distinguish between the social dimension and the sustainability dimension, as you said, the environmental dimension. And of course, first of all, we have to make sure that the Human Rights Convention is met and is stuck to.
Yeah.
But if we look at the sustainability aspect of it, I would say that producing in certain countries where probably the infrastructure isn't as good and where they are trying to catch up economically, if a German or a US American, European company comes there and tells them, okay, from now on you have to produce like this or like that, and then we offer training and we do audits and stuff. For me, it sounds a little bit like a very patriarchal system where we come in and we tell them what they need to do, but it's also our responsibility to make sure from the very beginning that the partners we choose are the right ones. And that's probably when this geographic setting comes in place, where we say, okay, maybe it's better to stay and have the majority of the supply chain in Europe or in countries where we already know that the infrastructure and the settings are given.
Yeah, of course, it's easier if you can keep the supply chain in Europe. I'm not sure it's realistic and feasible always, or if you can find you also have a shortage of workers, right? I mean, that's the first reason why we lost. I mean, Europe used to have a very strong apparel industry, but the reason we don't have it anymore is mainly because of the lack of workers. So yeah, I'm not sure this is a realistic. Of course, I agree with you. A lot of things would be easier if we keep production local. I'm just not sure this is realistic for a lot of sectors. But of course, you are right. I mean, if countries don't have good regulatory environments. I did a project, for example, on forced labor in Thailand, and in Thailand, migrant workers are really discriminated. They are not allowed to form unions, and this is against, what the ILO wants. So they haven't ratified an important ILO convention here. But of course, this makes it difficult then to design any measures. So there's only so much, of course, you can do as a company to really work against the regulatory environment. But still, I do think that having partners, working with your suppliers as partners, can get you quite far. Yeah, so I stop here.
So, I
think there's another question there.
Yeah, I think this, as a last question, because we are running out of time. Therefore, please.
Yeah, my question relates back to fast fashion. And with a more, or arguably more informed consumer than ever before, we still see a rise in fast fashion, and now even ultra fast fashion, talking about Shein. What do you think is the reason for that? And also now coming back to supply chains, I think with such a high pressure on cost and also time, it's much harder to solve these social and economic problems.
It's a tough question to finish this. So what do I think is the reason why we see ultra fast fashion? I mean, I'm not the target group, I think, of fast fashion. So for me, it's also puzzling as a trend, right? So, I mean, social media plays a big role, and Instagram, and yeah, but I can't really answer that. Why is it such a successful model? I think it really is successful, particularly with very, very young people. And that's maybe for us as educators, right? I mean, that's maybe the role we should have, like how to instill these values of sustainability and not changing fashion all the time. I don't know, maybe this is something where we could do better to just, you know, educate young people much, much earlier about the value of sustainability.
Okay, fine. Then thank you very much for the interesting discussion. Thank you very much, Miriam, for the very inspiring presentation and discussion. And I think we might close it here. Thank you very much for joining.